This video is going to be about checking fuel pressure, and so it's just a basic video. It won't take very long. And the reason we do this is we have to hook up a gauge and check and see how much actual fuel pressure we have. If we have a hard starting, no starting problem on a vehicle, we need to eliminate the fuel system. And so we're going to hook the gauge up, we're going to check the fuel pressure, and go from there. If you've already watched the video that I did on checking fuel volume, we did check the fuel pressure in that video as well. And so this is just checking fuel pressure, and that's it. So the tool that I'm going to be using is a Lisle. It's made by Lisle. It's a gauge, and a really good gauge. I really have been impressed with this gauge. But here's the box. It's a Lisle 55700 if you're interested. I think it costs a couple $100 at the time that we purchased it anyway. And it comes, when you open up the box, it comes with two different gauges. This gauge here is one that it goes up to 145 psi. You're reading the red scale. The black scale is 1000 kPa. And if you remember, kPa is the metric version of psi. So this is the 145 psi, and we've already looked up the fuel pressure specifications on this vehicle, and we should be operating somewhere in the neighborhood of 60, 70 psi. So this is the gauge we're going to be using. It does come with another gauge, and that's this one here. It's a much smaller gauge, but if you notice, it only goes up to 15 psi. So this gauge would only be used for carbureted systems that have a mechanical fuel pump, not an electric fuel pump. Most electric fuel pumps are going to be at least 30 psi. So this is not the gauge we want to be using this time for this vehicle. So we've got our gauge, and the next thing we need to do is we need to use the manifold. So the manifold looks like this. It's got a T right here, and it has a pressure relief valve on it, and it has a clear hose, and it has a black hose. So this is what we want to hook the gauge to. The gauge hooks onto it just like this. I do not want to see this. The gauge hooks onto a hose like this, but this is not the right way to do a fuel pressure test. So do not hook it up like this. The reason for that is because once you have the gauge hooked up like this, and we actually read fuel pressure, we're going to be up in the 70s for fuel pressure. If you don't have a way to relieve that pressure after you're done, you're going to spray fuel everywhere, and it's not a very safe thing to do, so we're not going to do that. So this is the way we've got our gauge hooked or set up, and we're going to go put that on the vehicle. The other adapter that we're going to need for this particular application is one like this. It looks like a bicycle tire, because this vehicle actually has a Schrader valve that you can use to check fuel pressure, which is kind of nice. Not every vehicle has that, but this one does. So we'll go ahead and hook it up to the vehicle, and then we'll go from there. I'm going to show you where the Schrader valve is on this particular vehicle. If you come up to where the fuel line comes in, here's the fuel line, it goes down to the fuel rail, and if we look right here where my finger is, there's a Schrader valve. And so that's what we're going to tap into to check the fuel pressure. And so I'm going to go ahead and tap into that, and then I'll show you what it looks like after I'm hooked up. Okay, I've got my fuel gauge here, and I've got my fuel line going down here, and you can see where I've got it hooked up to the fuel pressure rail. So it comes right down here, and I've got it hooked up to the fuel pressure rail. When you hook that up, a lot of times a little bit of gas will spray out, so it's a good idea to kind of pack a little rag down in there or something to kind of help absorb the gasoline. You really want to be careful with raw fuel spilling on the engine and stuff, because it can start a fire real easily. So you need to be careful with that. So now what we're going to do is we're going to start the vehicle up, and we're going to check for any leaks, and then we'll go ahead and look at the fuel pressure. The first step in checking fuel pressure is you want to check it with key on, engine off. So before you start the vehicle up, just turn the key on, and we want to see where the fuel pressure goes. So I'm going to go ahead and turn the key on. And the fuel pressure jumped up, and then it came right back down. So when the fuel pressure jumped all the way up, it jumped up to, looked like about 35 or 40, somewhere around there, and then it just bled right back down. What that's telling me is it's telling me that the fuel pump is working. It pushed the fuel up into the fuel rail, but the fuel pressure regulator or the check valve inside the tank is not functioning. So one of those two, it's either going to be the fuel pressure regulator or the tank check valve that's not working. And the symptom of this is going to be an extended crank. So you crank before it finally starts up. So that's going to be the symptom for it. And so if you have a vehicle that comes in with an extended crank problem, one of the things that you can look for is this right here. Okay, we're going to start the vehicle now and see what the fuel pressure does. Okay, fuel pressure jumped up to where it should be. So that tells me the fuel pump is probably okay, but the check valve inside the fuel pump may be going bad. So and the other thing you want to do is check to see if the fuel pressure holds once you shut the key off. So you turn the vehicle off, and if you notice, the fuel pressure bled right off. So there's a problem there. So the fuel pressure should hold for a good 30-40 minutes after you shut the key off. Okay, now that we've seen what happens when you have a bad either fuel pump check valve or regulator, let's see what happens on a system that's not quite so bad. So I fixed the issue that we were having on this one, so I'm going to turn the key on. And the fuel pressure jumps up to about where it should be, and then I turn the key off again, and if you notice, the fuel pressure is staying where it's at. So that's what it's supposed to do. So we'll go ahead and start the vehicle and see if the fuel pressure still goes to the operating pressure, and then we'll shut the vehicle off and see if it still stays there. So the fuel pressure is operating where it should. I'm going to go ahead and shut the vehicle off. And that fuel pressure should stay relatively high like that for a good 30 minutes or so after you shut the vehicle off. So if you look at this fuel pressure, it is bleeding off just a tad, so there's still a little bit of a problem, but I fixed the majority of the problem. So, which was actually it was a loose fitting down by the tank, so it was leaking a little bit of gas. So this is what you should see on it. So that's basically all there is to a fuel pressure test. Now to finish up the fuel pressure test, we need to disconnect the gauge. And this is where the manifold comes in that I was talking about. So we've got the manifold hooked up, and I've got the tube from the manifold going down into a gas can. So that way I'm not spilling gas all over the floor. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit or push the pressure relief valve to relieve the pressure inside the tank, or sorry, inside the gauge. And so I'm going to hold that valve for a minute. And if you notice, there's fuel that gets inside this line here. You can see the bubbles. And so that fuel is draining down into the tank and not on the floor. So now once all the fuel is drained out of this line, then I can go ahead and disconnect it from the engine, and then I'll be finished with my fuel pressure test.